Three barefoot children stood on a dusty wooden platform, trembling beneath a crudely painted sign, 3 Orphans, $3. People laughed. Some pointed, others bargained like they were buying livestock. But one man dismounted from his horse in silence. He didn't speak. He didn't haggle. He simply handed over $3 and carried those children away. Not because he had to, but because once someone had left him behind, too. The wind carried dust across the timber-planked street, whistling low through the bones of timberage like a song too tired to finish. Saturday brought the weekly market the clamor of barter horses tied to posts, sun-bleached faces negotiating bushels of corn bridles, and sometimes things no man should price. That morning a man rode into town on a lean bay, gelding his coat the color of mountain dirt, his hat pulled low. His name was Jack Dalton, but no one had spoken it aloud in years. Folks called him the trapper, the ghost up in Foxtail Ridge, or sometimes just nodded and looked away. He'd only come for kerosene and coffee, but life has a habit of changing course right when you stop expecting anything of it. That's when he saw them. A crude wooden platform had been set up near the edge of the market. It wasn't more than 5 feet wide, nailed together like a butcher's block. On it stood 3 children barefoot, and still clothes torn and clinging to them like memory. A sign hung around one of their necks, swinging in the dry breeze. 3 orphans, $3. They didn't cry. That made it worse. The youngest, a boy of maybe 3, had dirt smeared along his cheek like a bruise. The middle one, a girl with dark tangled hair, stared at her feet. The oldest, 6, maybe 7, looked out like a hawk, not with defiance, but with the quiet calculation of someone who had learned too soon not to trust. The crowd chuckled. $3 for all of 'em, hell, that's cheaper than a sack of flour. Wonder if they can wash dishes or herd chickens. Jack stopped. He didn't dismount, just stared. The man beside the platform, wearing a fancy vest and a cruel sort of smile, raised his voice. His name was Barnes Tucker, and everything about him smelled like greed, from the rings on his fingers to the way he pronounced the word profit. "Now listen here," Barnes shouted. Their mother ran off with a traveler, and their pa drank himself into the grave. They eat too much and talk too little, but him feeling generous today. Someone asked if the kids came with papers. Barnes barked a laugh. "Papers, you want a pedigree, buy a horse." The crowd laughed. Jack dismounted slowly, boots pressing into the earth like it owed him something. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a cracked leather pouch, and counted out $3 silver dull from time, warm from skin. Barnes sneered. "Oh, look who decided to play father. You sure that money's not stolen, Dalton? Or are you buying yourself some company for the long nights?" Jack met his eyes. "I reckon you should stop talking now." He held the coins out. Barnes took them, fingers twitching like he thought he'd won something. Jack stepped onto the platform. The children didn't move. He knelt slowly like someone trying not to startle a wounded bird. "You ain't for sale anymore," he said, voice like dry pine wood. "Come on." The oldest girl hesitated. The boy clung to her leg. The middle one, she just looked at him. Something flickered in her eyes, then trust, but the barest recognition of something not cruel. She stepped forward first. They rode out of town with no bags, no past, and no one calling after them. Jack didn't look back. Neither did the children. But halfway down the trail, under a sky turning the color of old gold, the boy leaned forward and touched Jack's shoulder. "Are you our pa now?" Jack didn't answer right away. He let the question hang there like the smoke of a fire not yet lit. "No," he said softly, "but he'll feed you. He'll keep you warm, and no one will ever price you again." That night they made camp at the edge of a creek. Jack knew from long ago the one where he'd once slept curled into a blanket too small for the cold. He lit a fire, boiled some beans, and tore old bread into pieces. The 3 children sat close, but not together, like strangers made to share a bench at a funeral. When the fire popped, the middle girl flinched. Jack didn't ask their names. He didn't offer his. He just handed each a cup and said, "Eat. Tomorrow's long." They obeyed. silent hungry. Only the eldest spoke, her voice like splintered cedar. "You gonna sell us again if we get sick?" Jack looked up. His hand stilled. "No." "Why not?" "That man said we ain't worth keepin'." Jack poked at the fire, the orange light dancing across his stubbled jaw. "He lied," he said. "And I reckon lies rot faster than children." Later, after the stars had broken across the sky and the fire was just ash, the middle child crawled closer to him and fell asleep by his side. She didn't speak, but her hand found his sleeve in the dark and held on. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched the sky where a single falling star split through the silence. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a man, completely alone. The ride home was long, not in distance, but in the weight it carried. Jack Dalton didn't say much as the sun sank behind the hills. He rode with the reins loose in one hand, the smallest child, Ben, bundled inside his coat. His tiny fingers clutched like bird talons at the worn fabric. The other two walked beside the horse, their steps silent as dusk pressed in. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't ask who he was. Maybe they'd learned, like he had once, that questions cost more than answers ever paid. The cabin came into view just as the stars began to show. A modest shelter built with hands that had once broken rock and tamed wild mares. Jack slid from the saddle, his boots thudding softly against the earth. "You can come in," he said, his voice rough from wind and years of talking to no one. The little girl, he'd later decide, hesitated at the porch. She eyed the door like it might eat her whole. Jack turned the latch, let the soft yellow lamplight spill out. It painted her small, dirt-streaked face gold. Inside, it smelled of pinewood ash and beans cooked too long. He laid Ben on the cot by the fire, then tossed another log on. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said without turning around. No one answered. That night he slept on the floor near the door. Not because he had to, because it seemed right. The three children huddled together on his cot, arms, tangled breaths shallow. And sometime before dawn, a soft whisper, barely a thread of sound, rose from the dark. "Will we be sold again?" Jack's eyes opened. He didn't move. He let the silence carry the answer first. "No," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." In town, the next day the storm began. It came not from the sky, but from a man in a snakeskin vest and a smile that held no warmth. Barnes Tucker. He leaned against the railing of the general store like he owned the wood it was built from. "Well, well, if it ain't Dalton the Drifter. Heard you made a sweet little trade yesterday. 3 kids for 3 coins. Hell of a bargain." Jack didn't rise to it. He reached for a bag of flour. Barnes stepped in closer. "Thing is, you forgot the paperwork. Those kids got a debt on their heads. Shelter, feedin', medical from the preacher's wife. Let's call it, $40 each." Jack looked up slowly. "I didn't see no receipt on their skin." Barnes smiled wolfish. "That's 'cause I'm a gentleman." A few townsfolk turned to listen. Jack's voice dropped low. "Gentlemen don't sell children." Barnes' hand landed on his holster, not a threat, just a reminder. "You got 2 choices, cowboy. Pay what you owe, or I take 'em back. And you know I got the law in my pocket." Jack let that hang there. The sun hit his face through the open doorway, casting deep lines in his weathered skin. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "When I was 6, a man like you sold me for a jug of rye and a saddle that didn't fit no horse. I worked 17 hours a day shoveling manure until I didn't know what my own name was anymore. You're right about one thing, Barnes." He stepped closer. His voice was quiet thunder. "Children cost something, but it ain't money." Back at the cabin, the children stayed near the fire. Ben coughed now and then. Luna, the quiet middle child, drew circles in the ash with her finger. Ellie, sharp-eyed and brittle, watched the window like a hawk. Jack sat outside on the porch, smoking a rolled cigarette, watching the horizon. The land was quiet in the way old wounds are quiet. But he knew the storm hadn't passed. Inside, Ellie finally broke the silence. "Are you going to give us back?" Jack didn't turn. "No, Even if they say you have to, he let the smoke drift from his lips. I ain't good at doing what they say. That night Jack pulled an old box from under the floorboards. Inside were letters, torn photographs, and a badge with the edges rusted from years of silence. It bore the name of a boy who once believed the world could be fixed. He placed it on the table and stared at it like a ghost. Then, as if on cue, a small hand touched his elbow. Luna. She didn't speak. He looked down and whispered more to himself than her. I never planned to buy anyone. I just saw myself in you. All three of you. She nodded, as if understanding more than words ever could. The next morning, someone had painted 3 names in shaky letters above the doorway. Ellie, Luna, Ben. It wasn't Jack. It wasn't the kids. But someone had claimed this house as theirs now, and for the first time in a long time it felt like home. The house wasn't much. Just 4 walls of weather-peeled pine, a roof that coughed when the wind hit right, and a chimney that wept smoke like old sorrow. But to 3 children who had only known crates, backroom beds, and cold dirt floors, it was a castle. Jack never called it home. He didn't have that word in him anymore. Not after what his own home became the night his father left the barn caught fire, and his mother stood in the yard screaming his name into an empty night that never answered back. But now he found himself hammering up a crossbeam at dusk, while 3 small shadows watched him from the steps. They didn't speak. They hadn't since the marketplace. Not a name, not a question, just silence and eyes that had already seen too much of the world. He didn't ask them anything either. Words were for people who had something to offer. Instead, he boiled a pot of beans on the wood stove, laid out 3 worn blankets near the fire, and set out spoons that didn't match. When the youngest, the little one with hair like hay and eyes too big for his face, picked up the spoon backward, Jack didn't correct him. He just watched quietly as the child ate like someone might snatch the food away. It took 5 days for the girl to stop sleeping with her boots on. 7 for the oldest boy to stop flinching whenever Jack stood too fast. By the second Sunday, Jack caught them rearranging the firewood pile into a crooked little fort, complete with pine cone guards. He didn't say a word, just stood back and let them build. Because sometimes healing starts when no one is watching. One cold evening, with frost biting the edges of the windows and coyotes singing on the ridge, Jack lit the lantern and sat at the table trying to mend an old saddle strap. His hands moved from memory. That's when the girl Ellie, he guessed though he hadn't dared ask, spoke her first words. "Do you beat kids?" He didn't look up. The question didn't come like a challenge. It came like a bruise she expected to bloom again. Jack's voice cracked on the flint of his past. "No." She stood still for a moment, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "You yell only at coyotes and fence posts." A long pause. Then Mr. Barnes yelled when the baby cried. Said we made too much noise to be worth keepin'. Jack's grip on the leather tightened. He could've cursed. Could've slammed something or gone outside to scream into the pines. But he didn't. He just leaned back, looked her in the eye, and said softly, "That man's voice doesn't get to live here no more." They didn't hug him, didn't run to sit on his lap, or call him Papa like some storybook dream. But that night, all 3 children dragged their blankets closer to the hearth. Close enough that Jack had to step over them to stoke the fire. He didn't say a word. He just let it happen. There was a drawer in the corner cabinet. Inside were scraps of parchment and old receipts, things Jack never threw away even when they stopped meaning anything. He added something new that week, a list of 3 names he thought might fit. Not names he chose, names he heard them whisper in their sleep. Ellie, Ben, Luna. Names had power, and once spoken out loud, they tended to stick to the bones. By the 3rd week, Jack caught Ben trying to brush the mare's tail with a spoon. The boy froze like a fawn when Jack saw him, but Jack just laughed. Not a big laugh, not the kind that echoes, just the kind that leaves warmth behind it. "You're gonna make her prettier than me," he said. Ben looked up, then down, then whispered, "You got a beard." "She don't." Jack grinned. Fair point, but peace never comes without echoes. It was on a Tuesday morning when the sky was soft and the frost hadn't yet melted that Jack spotted a horseman at the edge of the ridge watching. Barnes. His silhouette stiff in the saddle like a man who thought everything had a price and hated remembering the one thing he gave away for cheap. That night Jack cleaned his rifle. Not to use it. Just to feel the metal, the weight of protection. The kids didn't ask, but they watched. Later, under the low hush of stars, Jack stood on the porch. Ellie joined him without a word. She didn't look at him, only out at the pines. "If you could name this place," she asked, "what would you call it?" Jack thought for a while. Then quietly, "A place the wind don't push no more." She didn't answer, but she stayed next to him until the night swallowed the last flicker of lantern light through the window. And that's how a house with no name became a home, not through paint or wood or money, but through silence shared without fear, through space given without condition, through scars seen and left untouched. Because some homes aren't built, they're forgiven into being, and some fathers aren't born, they're trusted into becoming. The wind carried a stillness that afternoon, not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made the crows stop calling, the dust settle uneasily on the porch rail, and even the horses lift their heads, ears twitching. Jack Dalton felt it before he heard the hooves. He was oiling the hinges on the barn door when he saw the silhouette on the ridge. A wide hat, a thick belly. A horse too fine for a man like that. Barnes Tucker. Jack didn't say a word. He wiped his hands with a rag, eyes narrowing like someone squinting toward a storm he already knew was coming. Barnes rode down like he owned the sun, reined in with a smirk that soured the air. "Well now," Barnes drawled, slow as snake oil. "Ain't this sweet? Jack Dalton, famous orphan, now father to 3. Or is it kidnapper to 3? I lose track." Jack leaned against the barn, arms crossed, quiet. The silence was heavy. Barnes dismounted with a grunt and dusted off his coat. "See, you paid me $3? That was cute. But that was for the show. Not the paperwork, not the rights." He smiled like a butcher naming cuts. "You owe me, Dalton, and I come to collect." Jack said nothing. From the house, a screen door creaked. Ellie stood barefoot on the porch watching. Her little hands gripped the wooden rail like it might float her across danger. Barnes glanced toward her. "She your favorite, looks like the smart one. Tell you what, just give me the boy. The little one. Easy to train. Doesn't cry as much when you break him in early." That was when Jack moved. Not fast, just forward. Step by step, boot crunching gravel until they stood nose to nose. Jack's voice was quiet. "You don't talk about them like that. Not in front of me. Not ever." Barnes laughed. "Or what, you gonna shoot me in broad daylight? You think these kids are yours just 'cause they clung to your boot the day you flashed a few silver coins? You think this little farm makes you a father?" He leaned in, the smile sharpening. "You're still that boy no one wanted, Jack. And you think buying a few cast-offs changes that?" Something in Jack's jaw tightened. But his voice didn't rise. That was always the most dangerous kind of man, the one who didn't need to shout. "I was left behind," he said. "Same as them, but no one's leaving again. Not while I'm breathing." Barnes spit in the dirt. "Then we got ourselves a problem." He mounted his horse, eyes dark. 3 days. You bring 'em back, or he'll come with men who don't ask twice." And with that, he turned and rode off, leaving dust, the stink of arrogance, and the weight of a threat that didn't need repeating. That night, Jack sat on the front steps, a lantern flickering beside him. Ellie, Luna, and Ben were inside asleep, curled like cats in the room they now called the kids' place. He didn't touch his coffee. Just stared out into the dark, listening to the insects, the distant howl of a coyote, the memory of Barnes' voice replaying over and over in his head. Behind him, the door creaked again. Ellie stood in her nightdress, holding a threadbare blanket. "Is he coming back?" she asked. Jack looked at her. The moonlight caught her ice-old eyes, too old for a child that young. "Yeah," Jack said softly. "He might." She nodded, then sat beside him. The blanket touched his arm. "Mama used to say, bad men always come back." but good men stay until the end. Jack swallowed hard. Smart woman, he said. Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder. You're staying right. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the pain rise and settle. Yeah, baby. I ain't going nowhere. 2 nights later it came. The fire started in the barn, bright orange against the black of midnight. The horses screamed. Jack was out of bed before the second scream. Bucket in hand, boots half laced, he ran into the blaze. By the time the flames were put out, the east wall was gone. Clay, the mare, had bolted. But the children were safe. And in the ashes, Jack found something half buried, a silver belt buckle with a T engraved on it. He didn't need a jury. The next morning the sheriff came. Jack didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He just handed over the buckle and said Barnes left this behind. The sheriff sighed. This town's been quiet a long time, Jack. Don't go stirring mud. Jack didn't flinch. There are 3 children in that house who scream at night when they dream, and 1 man who thinks he still owns them. If this town wants to stay quiet, it better start listening to the right people. That afternoon, Jack fixed the barn wall alone. His hands blistered, his back ached, but each nail he hammered was a promise. Ellie brought him lemonade. She didn't say a word, just left it on a stump and stood nearby watching. Jack looked over and smiled. Not a big smile, just enough. We build things, little one, he said. When bad men burn it down, we build it back stronger. She didn't smile, but she nodded. And for the first time, Jack saw something shift in her eyes, something like hope. Jack Dalton knew silence could burn louder than fire. And that night, the flames were roaring. He woke to the scent first, smoke sharp and metallic coiling through the pine slats of his cabin. Then the crackle. Then Luna's scream. Jack, it's the barn. He didn't stop for boots. Just grabbed the bucket by instinct, bare feet slicing across the frozen ground. The barn lit up the night like a bonfire lit for ghosts. Clay, the old gelding, was kicking in his stall, panicked. Jack flung open the doors, unlatched the halter with shaking fingers, and pulled the horse into the snow. By the time the flames died, the barn was black bones. The smell of burned timber and wet ash clung to his skin like guilt. Ben clutched his legs, sobbing. Ellie stared at the ruin in silence, but it was little Luna who said the words no child should have to say. They wanted us to burn, didn't they? Jack didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he did. The next morning, Tucker's man rode up like he owned the wind. Barnes Tucker hadn't come himself. He never did the dirty work with his own hands. This time it was Wally Cobb, mean as winter and twice as sharp. Sat high in the saddle, spitting tobacco like punctuation. Boss says you owe him, Dalton. 3 kids, $3 sure. But what about fees, holding costs, bloodline? You never signed a release. That means they're still his. Jack stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His shirt still smelled like smoke. They're not cattle, Wally. Wally chuckled, squinting into the morning sun. Ain't they though? Eat your food, sleep under your roof, got no last name. What would a judge say? Ben peeked from behind Jack's leg. Wally tipped his hat mockingly at the boy. Tell the little one to pack. We'll be back Monday. With paper. He left the way snakes do quiet, but you still felt the trail of venom. Jack waited until the kids had gone inside. Then he stood by the ashes of the barn, boots half sunk in mud, and whispered like a man praying without hope. God, I don't have a receipt for love. All I got is what I give. That night he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the table carving a new nameplate for the front porch. The Dalton family's shallow letters at first, then deeper, until the wood knew it too. 3 days later they came. Barnes Tucker in a black coat too clean for the dirt he walked on. Behind him, 2 deputies with bored eyes and tight mouths. Legal muscle. Not law. The children were herded to the back room. Jack stepped outside, quiet but tall. There was no gun on his hip today. Only resolve. You came for a fight. Barnes smiled without teeth. I came for what's mine, And what the law forgot to write down, you didn't sign adoption papers. That means those kids are strays. Strays I fed, clothed, housed, and now I reclaim. You sold them. I sold a burden. You made it a circus. No, I made it a home. The deputies shifted. They'd seen men stand for less, fall for more. Barnes raised a document crisp and smug. This here's a formal claim. Unregulated transfer of dependence. That makes you a thief, Dalton. Jack didn't blink. Just stepped forward, voice low, and burning a barn full of children's that legal too. Silence fell like snow. Barnes' eyes narrowed. Careful, Cowboy. Accusations like that need evidence. From the cabin doorway, a voice rose. We saw him, me and Ellie. He lit the torch. It was Luna, barefoot, cheeks flushed, voice clear. Her hands trembled, but her words did not. He laughed when the fire caught, said we'd be better off ashes than a tax write-off. The deputies froze. Barnes stepped back half a pace, then smiled. Children lie, especially ones taught to. Jack knelt beside Luna, took her hand gently. You know what the truth is, sweetheart. She nodded her eyes, never leaving Barnes. Truth is what stays even when the fire's gone. That night no one took the children. Barnes left empty-handed, spitting curses into the wind. It wouldn't be the end of it. Jack knew that. Men like Barnes didn't walk away clean. But something had shifted. Luna had spoken. Ellie had stood behind her. And Ben had placed his carved wooden horse on the windowsill, facing outward like a silent sentry. Later, as the stars rose and the night grew quiet again, Jack sat on the porch alone. The chair creaked. His hands were black with soot still, but his chest had light in it. The door creaked open behind him. Ellie walked out with a blanket. I thought you might be cold, Dad. That word hung in the air, soft and steady. Not shouted, not explained. Jack looked up, voice cracking through the gravel in his throat. I never signed a thing. No papers, no seal. Ellie smiled. We didn't need a receipt either. The wind swept dry leaves across the plank porch of the saloon, as if the town itself was unsure which direction to go. Timberidge had always been a place of whispers, never outright cruel, but never brave enough to stand in front of anything either. That morning the street was quiet in the way it only gets before a storm. Horses were tied tighter. Storefronts had fewer eyes at the window. The church bell hadn't rung, though it was Sunday. Inside the general store, Miss Ida May stopped stacking flour sacks when she saw the shadows outside. They're back, she whispered to no one, then drew the curtain closed. Down the road, Jack Dalton stepped off his porch, steady as ever. He didn't wear his gun on his hip that day. Instead, he wore a clean shirt and the look of a man who had chosen peace, even when the war came looking for him. Ellie gripped his hand too tightly for a girl her size. The two younger ones clung to her skirt like roots to earth. He crouched down, eye level with them. No matter what you hear today, no matter what they say, I know what we are, he said softly. And that's family. Ain't a paper on this earth can tell me different. The boy nodded, tears already wobbling in his lashes. Then came the sound of hooves. 4 men rode in with Barnes Tucker at the lead, his long black coat flapping behind like the shadow of a vulture. He dismounted with a smirk that didn't quite touch his eyes. Town folk, he shouted loud enough for shutters to tremble. This man here, this outlaw, stole from me. Paid me $3 for what I raised, clothed and fed for months. He took my property and parades it through town like some savior. He spat near Jack's boot. And he's got you all fooled. Y'all always did fall for orphans with sad eyes. Jack's voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning like frost. I didn't steal them, Barnes. You sold them on a crate like cattle. I just didn't leave them there. Barnes barked a laugh. You think that makes you a hero. They ain't yours, Dalton. No papers, no name rights, no claim. You're a drifter. A nobody with a broken cabin and a saddle full of ghosts. From behind, a voice called out. You sold them in front of my bakery. All heads turned. Mrs. Mary Calloway, gray bun pinned neat, stepped out with her cane. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. You nailed that sign with your own hammer. 3 orphans, $3. I watched you pocket the coins. You didn't even look back at them. Barnes stared at her. Old woman, you're not well. Everybody knows you forget your own birthday. I remember that morning better than my own wedding day, she snapped. Because it was the first time I ever saw shame in this town. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. From the sheriff's office, Sheriff Howard Frank stepped out, arms crossed. He'd always walked like a man who had more regrets than bullets. His badge glinted in the sun, but his eyes had grown dull over years of looking the other way. Sheriff Barnes barked. You gonna let this farce continue? Arrest him. Take the children. Frank looked at Jack, then at the 3 little faces peeking from behind his leg. You know, he said slowly, I always figured the law was about keeping order, but sometimes it's just about doing what's right. He took his time stepping down the porch. I've seen more fatherhood in how Jack Dalton makes pancakes than I ever saw in your ledger books, Barnes. Barnes narrowed his eyes. You want a war over this? No, Jack said quietly, stepping forward. I don't want a war. I want the truth to stand on its own feet. And then Ellie, brave, bone-thin Ellie, stepped in front of him, chin raised. We're not for sale, she said, voice steady. And he's the only man who ever tucked us in at night without fear in his hands. Silence fell like snow. It was an old silence tune that asked every person on that street to answer it. Miss Ida May stepped out first. He buys flour every week, enough for 4. Then Mr. Ben Cargill, the blacksmith, fixed my son's horseshoe with no charge. Even Pastor Lane spoke, arms folded. You never once gave those children a name, Barnes, but Jack gave them birthdays. Barnes turned, seeing the tide against him now. You'll regret this. All of you? No, Frank said, placing a hand on his holster. I think we finally regret not speaking sooner. Barnes mounted his horse, furious. They're not his. Jack didn't raise his voice. They're not mine, he said, but him theirs. The words hung there like a promise written in dust and sunlight. That night, back at the cabin, the children sat on the porch eating cornbread while Jack smoked in silence. Ellie looked up. You okay, Pa? Jack smiled, weary and soft. I ain't been okay most of my life, he murmured, but tonight I feel found. And across the field, someone left a fresh pie on the fence post. No note, no signature, just a quiet way of saying, we chose your side too. The sun hadn't crested fully over the hills when Jack Dalton saddled up. The frost on the grass hadn't yet melted, but something in the wind felt heavier than cold. It smelled like iron and wood smoke and something final. He looked out across the meadow where the fog still clung low like breath that refused to be exhaled. Behind him, the cabin was quiet, but not still. 3 small shapes watched from the window. Jack didn't turn back. Not this time. He rode alone into the clearing, wide, golden, and too quiet for a place where cattle usually grazed. It was Barnes Tucker who waited for him there, sitting high on a black stallion flanked by 3 hired guns. Jack knew the type men who'd shoot first if they were paid well and asked later if they sobered up. Barnes spat. Well, look who crawled out from the mountain with a badge of honor in his damn beard. Thought you'd run Dalton. Guess I underestimated the fool in you. Jack dismounted slowly. His boots met the frosted earth with the certainty of someone who'd buried dreams and brothers alike beneath soil just like this. He didn't reach for the rifle strapped to the saddle. He didn't need to. I'm not here to run, Jack said, voice dry as the pine bark he used to carve names into. I'm here to remind you those kids ain't yours. They never were. Barnes laughed, cruel and guttural. You paid $3 damn. What you think that bought you sainthood? You bought what I let you buy. But contracts, they don't cover sentiment, Dalton. And now I'm here to collect. Jack looked up not at Barnes, but at the sky, soft and blue, as if unaware of what men might do beneath it. Funny thing, he said. When I was a boy, I watched a man beat a horse 'cause it wouldn't kneel fast enough. The man walked away proud. But the horse, that horse died standing. He took one slow step forward. The meadow seemed to still. A hawk cried in the distance. You know what them kids did last night? Jack asked. Ben sang himself to sleep. Luna, she said thank you without whispering it. And Ellie, she stood between her brother and a fire she couldn't put out. He paused. Don't you dare tell me what I paid for. Barnes' jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the men beside him. You can dress it up with poetry and dirt, he snapped, but those kids are liabilities. No papers, no blood. Just 3 broken mouths to feed. You ain't a hero, Jack. You're a fool wearing a father's boots. Jack's hands clenched, but he didn't raise his voice. I don't wear a father's boots, Barnes. I walk barefoot through the memory of the man I needed and never had. The insult hung there between them. The hired guns shifted. One of them, younger, dark-haired, dropped his eyes. Barnes growled, You walk away now. He'll let you keep your silence. You push this, you lose everything. You want a war. Dalton Jack took another step. I want the truth. Then, before anyone could move, the sound of hooves broke the air. Sheriff Walt Granger rode in from the tree-lined coat, flapping like a battered flag. Behind him, a frail but determined figure held tightly to his waist. Miss Mary Thomason, the old woman who ran the post office, face pale, but eyes burning. Walt dismounted hard. Enough, he said. Barnes snapped, You got no right. Mary raised her voice clear and shaking. You sold them children like mules. I saw it. So did God. And I ain't afraid of you no more, Barnes Tucker. Jack closed his eyes, just for a breath, then opened them again. Walt pulled a folded slip of paper from his coat. Signed testimony. We got it. Barnes' face changed, not fear exactly, but the animal realization of being cornered. The 2 older guns took a step back. The youngest one turned and walked away. Barnes growled, You take the word of an old crone over mine, Walt answered calmly. I'd take the word of a woman with nothing to lose over a man who never lost anything he didn't steal. A pause. Then Walt added softer, You're under arrest for unlawful sale of minors, intimidation, and arson. And you're not going to buy your way out this time. Barnes spat, but his hands slowly raised. The sun finally broke through the clouds, glinting off the iron cuffs as they clicked shut. Jack didn't cheer, didn't gloat. He just looked back toward the ridge. He could almost see them, 3 small silhouettes pressed against the window. Waiting. That night he sat alone on the porch while the kids slept inside. Luna had asked for another story. Ellie had tucked Ben in. The kettle still steamed faintly behind him. The sheriff had asked him earlier, Why'd you risk your life for 3 kids with no papers, no name, no ties? Jack hadn't answered then. But now, in the stillness, he whispered to the wind. Because sometimes the only thing that makes a man real is choosing to stand for something no one else sees. He looked down at his hands. Worn, cracked, stained with ash and soot and time. Then up again. Inside the cabin, Ben stirred in his sleep and whispered, Pa. Jack didn't move. But something in his face, something soft, long hidden, finally settled. And just like that, the meadow outside the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a beginning. The courtroom wasn't much more than a church with its pews stripped out and a gavel where the Bible used to be. Light slanted in through the high windows, catching on the dust, dancing in the stillness like memories that didn't want to rest. Jack Dalton sat silent at the defense table, his hat folded in his lap, back straight as a fence post. He didn't say a word, but his presence carried weight, the kind earned by years of keeping promises no one else heard. Barnes Tucker stood on the other side of the room, clean-shaven, smug in his brown leather vest and gold watch chain. He leaned toward the judge like they were old poker buddies. The man paid for half a horse and walked off with 3 mouths to feed Barnes, said, his voice slick as boot oil. If we start letting cowboys adopt strays for loose change, pretty soon the whole town will be raising feral children. A low murmur passed through the room. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't need to, because on the back pew she had stood. Mary Colleen Weaver, widow, 76 years old, hands as knotted as the roots of an old oak tree. Her coat was faded green, the same she wore every Sunday since her husband died 12 years back. Her voice had not been heard in public since the stroke took half her face. But now she stepped forward, cane in one hand, something far heavier in the other memory. The judge blinked. "Mom, do you wish to testify?" She nodded, slow and sure. They helped her up front. Mary didn't sit. She stood looking not at the judge, not at Jack, but straight into Barnes Tucker's eyes. "I was there," she said. Her voice was raw but steady. "I was at the market the day those children were sold." Barnes scoffed. "You were feeding chickens, Mary. You don't even know what day it is half the time." Mary didn't blink. "You were laughing, Barnes," she said, and the words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. "You called them unbroken stock, said the youngest one still had milk teeth." I remember that. The room stiffened. The sheriff shifted in his seat. Even the judge leaned forward a little. Mary turned slowly to face the children in the gallery. Ellie held Ben's hand. Luna sat quiet, her eyes locked on the old woman like she was watching the last sunrise before a storm. "I saw their faces," Mary whispered. "And I didn't speak. I didn't stop you. I went home and baked bread like nothing had happened." She turned back to Barnes, and now her voice broke not with weakness but with the weight of something long withheld. "I have lived with that silence for 2 years, Barnes. You, on the other hand, seem to sleep just fine." Barnes stepped forward, face flushed. "They were abandoned," he barked. "Left on my land like stray pups. I fed them, kept them warm, didn't owe them a damn thing beyond that." Jack finally looked up. "Just once. They weren't yours to sell." Barnes turned to him, his voice like poison in honey. "You think you're some kind of savior, Jack? Some lonesome messiah on horseback. You paid $3 silver for what amounts to liability, not family." "I didn't buy them," Jack said, quiet as dusk. "I rescued them." Silence folded the room like a blanket. The judge cleared his throat, but didn't interrupt. Mary continued, voice softer now, like a lullaby said backward. "There's a kind of wrong," she said, "that festers in the soil of a town. You let it stay, and pretty soon even the wheat tastes bitter. I remember the day Barnes sold those babies, and I remember every day since because I didn't stop him." She paused, then turned to the children again. "I can't undo what happened, but I can speak now. For them. For the man who didn't walk away." The gavel came down with a crack like lightning over dry land. Judge Crowley leaned forward. "This court recognizes the testimony of Mrs. Weaver and the written record of the sale. The children will remain under Mr. Dalton's guardianship. Mr. Tucker, your conduct will be reviewed under state investigation for illegal child trade and fraud." Barnes' face went pale, then red, then something in between the color of a man who just lost more than land or money. As people filed out, Mary stepped down slowly. Jack rose to meet her halfway, hat in hand. They stood for a second, saying nothing. Then Mary whispered, "I should have spoken sooner." Jack gave her a slow nod. "You spoke when it mattered." Luna reached out not to Jack, but to Mary. A hand, small and warm, curling around older fingers that had long forgotten what forgiveness felt like. Mary gasped softly, not from pain, but recognition. Memory did not always punish. Sometimes it healed too. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through a stretch of gray sky. Jack stepped into the light with 3 children at his sides. The street was quieter than usual. Some folks watched, others turned away. But for once, Jack didn't feel like a stranger. He didn't say a word. He just tipped his hat and walked them home. Jack Dalton stood on the porch of the little house he built with splinters in his fingers and silence in his chest. The spring wind came soft through the trees, stirring the thin white curtain behind the cracked window pane. Inside, someone was laughing, not the cruel kind that floats through saloons or courthouses, but the kind that stumbles out of a child's chest when they think no one's watching. He hadn't heard that sound in a long time. Not since before the war. Not since before people started handing him pity like it was something he'd lost, and not something he never asked for in the first place. Ben was chasing Luna in circles with a wooden horse head nailed to a broomstick. Ellie sat on the floor, carving letters into a pine board. Her tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth in the kind of concentration Jack remembered from his own mother, the one face he couldn't picture anymore. He stepped inside, boots heavy with road dust. "What are you making?" he asked, voice low and graveled. Ellie didn't look up. A name. For what? She finally turned, holding up the board with both small hands. The letters were crooked honest. "Our house." Jack blinked, and for half a breath his throat betrayed him. He nodded. "That's a fine name," he said. The town had stopped whispering. Folks still glanced, but they no longer turned their backs. The sheriff tipped his hat now, not because of fear, but respect. Mary, the shopkeeper's widow, had started leaving sweet rolls in a basket at their door every Sunday, just in case the children are growing, she'd say, even though she knew they were. Barnes Tucker had been gone a week now, hauled off in shackles, sputtering threats. "Those brats weren't yours to take. I sold 'em fair. What's $3 to a nobody like you?" Jack hadn't answered him then. He didn't need to. Some things silence carves deeper than any bullet. But that night, after the children were asleep, Jack sat by the fireplace with an old letter in his hands. The ink was faded. His own father's name scratched out by war records long buried. No return address. Just a single line. "Forgive me, son, I didn't know how to stay." He folded it slowly and placed it under Ellie's sign. Some houses are built from wood, others from mercy. One morning, Luna touched his arm while he was pouring coffee. "Can we paint the house?" Jack blinked. "Paint?" She nodded. "Yellow, like corn biscuits." He chuckled. "We'll need more than corn biscuits to pay for it." But that afternoon the townsfolk showed up. Mrs. Mary with a bucket of old paint, the blacksmith with brushes. Even old Mr. Finley, who hadn't spoken to Jack in 5 years, brought nails and 2 shutters he carved himself. By sundown, the house wore yellow like a Sunday dress, and for the first time, Jack saw it. Not the building, but the thing it had become, a place no one was afraid to return to. At supper, Ellie looked up from her plate. "Jack, if we ever go away, will this house miss us?" He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. "No," he said softly. "A house don't miss, but hearts do. And this house has got ours nailed into the floorboards." Ellie smiled. Then we'll never be far. That night he heard it. Not a sound outside, but a sound inside, deep buried. It was a voice, soft, feminine, from a time before. "You finally came home, Jack." He sat up, heart thudding, but there was only firelight and the shape of 3 sleeping children in the loft above. He exhaled slowly. Grief doesn't always leave. Sometimes it just gets quiet. Like an old friend sitting on the back porch, finally too tired to argue. The next morning, Jack carved a sign to hang above the door. Not Dalton Ranch. Not Jack's place. Just home. When Barnes' lawyer rode into town weeks later, the saloon doors groaned under the man's weight. He was slick, full of law and loopholes. He stopped Jack outside the general store. "My client insists he never signed over legal guardianship. The children are technically still his property." Jack didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Do your books say how a child cries when she's cold? Do they tell you what it means when she finally laughs, or what it costs a man to earn that trust back?" The man blinked, unsure. Jack continued, voice even. "Tell Barnes this: if he sets 1 foot on this land again, he won't leave with a single thing that breathes." The lawyer left. No one saw him again. That evening, as the sun curled low like a dog at rest, the children dragged their mattresses outside to sleep beneath the stars. Jack followed, unsure. "Why out here?" he asked. Ben pointed. "The roof creaks." Luna added, "and the stars look like freckles on God's face." Jack lay beside them, his hat pulled low. Ellie whispered, "I think the sky's just a big ceiling, and someone's looking through." Jack didn't reply, but in that silence, something inside him, something frozen for decades, finally cracked and melted and flowed toward those 3 small hands resting near his own. He looked up, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel small under the stars. He felt known. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a house anymore. This was the place his soul came home to. The wind that afternoon carried the copper scent of dust and sun-split wood. It was festival day in Timber Ridge 4th of July, but out here in the high plains, fireworks didn't just crack the sky. They cracked open something else. Memories, ghosts, regrets. Jack Dalton stood at the edge of the crowd, boots planted in dirt as red as old blood. His hat shaded most of his face, but the fine lines near his eyes were sharp enough to carve out years. A child ran by, dragging a stick that made a rattling song against the rail fence. Jack didn't flinch, just watched. Up ahead, the town square had transformed. Bunting waved from porch rails. Tables creaked under peach pies and deviled eggs. The townsfolk milled about, laughing, dancing, pretending they hadn't watched him from behind curtains a few months earlier when he walked down Main Street with 3 orphans and a bag of flour. Ellie, Luna, and little Ben had changed since then. Not in the way children grow taller or get louder, though those were true too. No, there was something deeper. They looked like they belonged now. Especially Ellie. She rode in the junior horseback parade that afternoon, back straight, chin-up hair in tight braids. The townsfolk clapped when she passed, but Jack only gave her the smallest nod. That was their way. She'd know he was proud. Someone tapped Jack's shoulder. It was Clara May, the widow who ran the sewing shop. "You comin' to sit down, Jack? There's pie left." He gave a polite half-smile, voice dry like old leather. "I ain't quite earned my place at the table yet." She stared at him, head tilted. "Well, that's a mighty long debt you think you owe. Even the Lord forgives faster." Jack said nothing. The music shifted. Someone started strumming a fiddle, slow and mournful. He looked toward the open space near the bonfire pit, and that's when he saw him. Barnes Tucker. The man stood like a vulture in a suit, greasy hair slicked back, his smirk greased with arrogance. Though he'd been stripped of his land and reputation after the trial, he still had money. Enough to buy suits, enough to stand there like justice hadn't touched him at all. Jack's jaw clenched. His hand hovered near his belt, not for the pistol left that home, but out of habit, the way old wounds make fingers twitch. Barnes saw him. Grinned. "Dalton," he called across the field just loud enough. "You raised those brats to lie as good as you do." The words were sour whiskey. Jack turned slow. "They tell the truth," Jack said calmly, because no one paid him not to. Barnes' smile faltered. A few townsfolk quieted. The tension hummed in the air like a taut wire. Jack took a step closer, voice low. "You think showing your face here makes you a man again?" Barnes spat in the dust. "This town forgets fast. So do orphans. They latch on to whoever feeds them." Jack didn't move, didn't blink. No, they remember who didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the eyes of children behind Jack. Ellie had come up behind him without him noticing. Luna, too, holding Ben's hand. Barnes looked at the kids and muttered, "They're not even yours." Jack turned to his children. That's so Ellie took one step forward, her voice clear as a church bell. "He may not be blood, but he's the first man who never asked what we could give him." Jack swallowed hard. His throat was dry and aching. She wasn't just speaking for herself. Barnes turned and slithered into the crowd, but not fast enough to outrun the shame left in his wake. Later that night, as dusk settled and the prairie turned lavender, the fireworks began. One by one, the sky bloomed with color. Ben sat in Jack's lap, clutching a blanket. Luna leaned against his arm, humming something she never learned from a book. Ellie sat on the railing, kicking her boots, eyes reflecting blue, red, and gold explosions above. "Do you miss being alone, Pa?" Ellie asked softly. Jack exhaled slow. "Sometimes, but only when the house is too quiet, which ain't often." She smiled, turned her face to the sky. "Mama used to tell us stars were holes in heaven where the light comes through." Jack nodded. "Maybe that's true. Maybe that's how folks find their way back." Ellie tilted her head. "To where? To the ones who still love him." The firework finale thundered overhead, a wide burst of white and silver that lit up the entire field. People gasped, clapped, whistled. But Jack barely noticed. He was watching his children. He'd once buried the idea of family deep like bones in frost. But now it had grown again, 3 fragile, stubborn, beautiful shapes. And for the first time in years, as the night air cooled and fireflies returned to the grass, he didn't feel like a man who'd been rescued. He felt like a man who had something to protect. The bonfire cracked as twilight settled over Timber Ridge, painting the sky in a wash of bruised purple and gold. The Fall Harvest Festival had always been a noisy thing, fiddles scratching out half-tuned joy children racing with sticky cheeks, and someone always trying to sell cider too sweet for its own good. But on the edge of that chaos, near the picket fence of the churchyard, stood Jack Dalton. He didn't wear a smile. Never did. His face was carved by the wind like the cliffs out past Miller's Creek, quiet, worn honest. He leaned against a cedar post, arms folded, one boot crossed over the other, like a man with nowhere to be, but too many places to remember. And just beyond him, in the soft light of the lanterns, Ellie, Ben, and Luna spun in slow, awkward circles to the sound of the town's fiddle. They weren't the same children he'd lifted off a wooden auction stand months ago. No, these ones had light in their eyes now. Ben laughed like he didn't know what fear was anymore. Luna wore her hair in Braidshire idea. Ellie held them both like a compass. She was still watching every doorway, but her shoulders weren't so tight. Not tonight. Jack watched, arms stiff, jaw clenched. He wanted to move, wave, say something, but his throat wouldn't play along. He never told them to call him Pa, never asked, and they never offered. That's how they survived, by keeping distance, dressed in silence. Behind him a voice came like rusted wire through warm wind. "You buying trophies now, Dalton, or still collecting broken things like always?" Jack didn't turn. He didn't have to. The voice belonged to Barnes Tucker, still slicked back and greased like a snake under moonlight. His coat had buttons that shined too much and a cane he didn't need. "Thought prison might humble you," Jack said, his tone dry as the land. "Funny," Barnes sneered. "I thought playing house with 3 brats might finally break you." Jack finally looked at him. One good eye squinted under the brim of his hat. The other had a scar now, faint but permanent, a gift from that night Barnes came with fire. "I didn't break," Jack said low. "I grew roots." Barnes snorted, stepping closer. "They'll never love you, you know, or trust you. You're just another stop on their trail of damage." Jack didn't answer. Didn't need to. The kind of pain Barnes tried to sling no longer landed. Not where it used to. A child's giggle rang through the lantern light. Luna was tugging Ben's sleeve and pointing at something, no someone. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, was staring at Jack from across the field. Curly blonde hair, muddy shoes. Probably the preacher's grandkid. He shuffled closer, then spoke loud enough for half the gathering to hear. "Mr. Are you their dad?" Jack blinked. His hand twitched. Behind him, Barnes chuckled with venom. "Go on, Cowboy. Tell him you bought them like cattle." Jack stared down at the boy, the question hanging in the air like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The music faltered behind him. Someone lowered the fiddle. He looked at the boy and passed him to the children. Ellie had stopped spinning. She stood still now, clutching her sibling's hands, her eyes locked onto his. And in that moment, something passed between them, not a word, but a knowing. A kind of quiet permission. Jack turned back to the boy and said, almost a whisper, "No, I'm not their dad." Pause. "They're my family." The boy tilted his head, confused. But Ellie smiled. Small, brave. Enough. Then, for the first time, she led the others across the grass. Ellie reached Jack first, took his weathered hand in both of hers, and whispered so close he felt the words press against his ribs. "You don't have to ask us to call you anything. We already did, just never out loud." Luna hugged his side. Ben clutched his coat. Jack didn't cry. His eyes stayed dry like the desert, but his chest ached with something he didn't have a name for. Barnes, seeing the circle tighten, scoffed once more. "Sweet. Until they leave you like everyone else." Jack didn't even look at him. Not everyone runs, Barnes. Only the ones with nowhere left to stand. Someone tapped Barnes on the shoulder. Sheriff McKee, wordless. Just a gesture toward the road. Barnes spit near the dirt and left. The sky grew darker. Stars blinked open. Fireflies took up where the lanterns dimmed, and near the fence post Jack knelt. "I didn't think I could be anyone's father," he murmured. "But I'd fight the whole world not to lose what I've got now." Ellie looked at him, her voice steady. "You didn't ask us to love you, Jack. You just showed up and stayed. They didn't say anything more that night. They didn't have to. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's a hand being held longer than needed. It's 3 kids sleeping under one roof because they finally believe no one's going anywhere. It's a man with a past who finally hears the name he never thought he deserved and realizes he's been earning it in silence, one small act of love at a time." The wind rolled gently across the plain, lifting the dust just enough to make the morning feel like memory. Jack Dalton stood alone by the fence he'd rebuilt with hands still scarred from that winter. Beyond him, the valley stretched wide golden in the early sun. The house behind him was quiet. Too quiet. He could still hear the girls laughing in the kitchen, even though they hadn't lived there in months. They were grown now, 2 married, 1 off to school. But ghosts had a way of lingering, especially the good ones. He reached down and picked up the wooden horse Ben had carved when he was 8, still rough, still missing 1 ear. He ran his thumb over the groove. That boy had called him Pa before Jack believed he deserved it. "Funny thing," Jack whispered to no one, "you raised 3 kids for 15 years and the thing that stays with you is how they looked when they first stopped being scared of you." A cough broke the silence. He turned. Barnes Tucker stood a few yards away. Older, smaller. Somehow his pride worn down like the heels of a gambler's boot. The sun struck his face, and Jack noticed the tremble in the man's hands. "You gonna shoot me?" Barnes rasped. Jack said nothing. The last time they met, Barnes had been dragged away in iron cuffs, spewing venom about debts unpaid and children stolen. Now he looked like time had wrung the venom out and left only the bitterness behind. "I got out," Barnes said. "Early release. Heart condition," they said. Jack leaned against the fence post. "You came all this way to tell me that?" Barnes huffed. "No, I came to see if you still had 'em. The kids." "They ain't kids anymore," Jack replied. "But they're mine." Barnes laughed once, dry and hollow. "I always figured you'd run out of goodness eventually. Maybe throw them back once they started costing more than $3. Jack didn't flinch. They were never for sale. The silence hung thick. "I didn't know what I was doing back then," Barnes muttered. "World chewed me up young. Thought the only way to survive was to be harder than everyone else, meaner. That why you sold 3 children like they were cattle." Jack's voice was flat but sharp. "You trying for pity, Barnes?" "No," Barnes said quickly. "Hell no. I ain't here for that." Jack studied him. His face had collapsed into itself, no longer the arrogant land baron of Timber Ridge. Just an old man who couldn't carry what he'd done. "You brought shame to that whole town," Jack finally said. "There's folks who still whisper your name like it's a curse." Barnes looked down. "I know. I get letters. People spitting at my name. Then what do you want?" "I want to ask." Barnes paused. "I want to ask if they're all right." "The kids. Did they grow up okay?" Jack nodded slowly. "They grew up with bruises that took years to stop bleeding on the inside. But they're whole now. Stronger than either of us ever were." Barnes looked like he'd swallowed gravel. "That's more than I deserve to hear." "You're right." A long silence stretched. Then, surprisingly, Barnes' voice broke, cracked like a branch in frost. "I've got no one left, Jack. No one waits for me. I used to think money made a man worth remembering. Now I just want someone to say my name without spitting after it." Jack turned to look at the valley, the sun rising soft over the hills. He let the words sit there. "You know what Ben told me once?" Jack said quietly. "He said, sometimes, Pa, I think the worst men used to be the saddest boys." I didn't know what to say to him then. But I know now. Barnes blinked. "You were a sad boy who made hell out of that sadness," Jack continued. "You turned pain into profit, and then you lost everything. Barnes opened his mouth but said nothing. "I won't hate you," Jack said. "But I won't invite you in either." Barnes nodded. "Fair enough." He turned to leave, but Jack called after him. "There's a shelter 3 miles east. They feed folks who ain't earned it because kindness doesn't keep score. You show up there and maybe someone'll look you in the eye again." Barnes paused. That's more mercy than I ever gave." Jack shrugged. "Then maybe it's time you learned what mercy tastes like." Barnes walked away slowly, his shadow stretching long behind him. Jack stood there a moment longer, staring at the horizon, then went back inside. The wooden horse still sat in his hand. He placed it gently on the mantel next to a picture of Ellie, Luna, and Bentaken under the cottonwood tree, the day they left for good. He sat in the old rocking chair. A breeze slipped through the window and brought with it the scent of lilacs. That meant spring was near. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while he let himself rest not from weariness, but from peace. What the heart takes it remembers, but what it gives it lives on in others. That was the quiet truth of Jack Dalton's life. He gave away $3 silver. He got back a family, a purpose, and something even rarer, a name that meant safety when spoken by someone else.